Millionaire crosses paths with homeless woman in park. Days later, she makes an unexpected revelation. Hello and welcome to 80s Love Stories, where I, your favorite narrator, Christopher, bring you an exciting love story straight from the unforgettable 1980s. Get ready for a journey full of nostalgia and incredible twists. Today's story is truly remarkable, with an ending that's sure to touch your heart and leave you amazed. So, stay with me until the very last moment. I hope this experience is unforgettable for you, and may God bless you and your family. Now, let's get started. The autumn wind scattered fallen leaves across Central Park as Richard Blackwood strode along the winding path, his Italian leather shoes crunching against the pavement. At 45, he cut an imposing figure in his tailored Brooks Brothers suit, silver streaking his temples in a way that only enhanced his distinguished appearance. His success as an investment banker had brought him everything money could buy. Yet walking through the park that October evening in 1984, he felt the familiar emptiness that no amount of wealth seemed to fill. He'd taken to these evening walks lately, finding some solace in escaping his penthouse apartment and the constant demands of Wall Street. The Walkman clipped to his belt played Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the melody matching his melancholic mood as twilight descended over Manhattan. That's when he saw her. She sat alone on a park bench, her worn coat pulled tight against the chill. Even in her obvious state of hardship, there was something striking about her presence, a quiet dignity in the way she held herself, her honey-blonde hair falling in waves around a face that spoke of both gentleness and strength. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, though the hardships of living on the streets had likely aged her prematurely. Richard found himself slowing his pace, then stopping altogether. He'd passed countless homeless people before, always averting his eyes like most New Yorkers did. But something about this woman made him pause. Perhaps it was the book in her lap, a weathered copy of Pride and Prejudice that seemed incongruous with her circumstances. She must have felt his gaze, because she looked up then, her clear blue eyes meeting his. There was no plea for help in that look, no indication she expected anything from him. Instead, he saw a flash of something that caught him off guard. Intelligence, pride, and a hint of defiance. "Good book?" he heard himself asking, surprising himself as much as her. She studied him for a moment before answering, her voice carrying a trace of southern accent. "Now one of my favorites, though Mr. Darcy could do with a bit less pride, don't you think?" Richard found himself smiling, the first genuine smile he could remember in weeks. And perhaps Elizabeth with a little less prejudice. That's half the fun, though, isn't it? Watching them both learn to see past their first impressions. She closed the book carefully, running her fingers over its worn cover. "I'm Richard," he said, taking a step closer. "So, Sarah?" she replied, though he noticed she hesitated slightly before giving her name. He gestured to the empty space beside her. "May I?" Sarah nodded, shifting slightly to make room. As Richard sat down, he noticed how she subtly moved to maintain a proper distance between them. Up close, he could see that despite her circumstances, she took care with her appearance. Her clothes, though worn, were clean, and her hair was neatly combed. "So what brings someone who reads Jane Austen to a park bench at sunset?" he asked. Sarah's smile held a touch of irony. "Would you believe a series of unfortunate events worthy of a novel themselves?" "I might," Richard replied, "though I suspect your story is more interesting than fiction, perhaps. But not all stories are meant to be shared with strangers in the park, even well-dressed ones who know their Austen." Richard couldn't help but chuckle at her gentle rebuke. "Fair enough, though I hope you'll at least share your thoughts on whether Emma or Elizabeth is the more compelling heroine." What started as a brief literary discussion stretched into a longer conversation. Richard found himself captivated by Sarah's insights and wit. She was clearly well-educated, though she carefully steered the conversation away from personal details about her past. As darkness began to fall in earnest, Sarah closed her book decisively. "I should go. The shelter has strict check-in times." Richard stood with her, suddenly reluctant to see her leave. "Will you be here tomorrow? Same time?" Sarah studied him for a long moment. "Why?" "Because I'd like to continue our conversation, and," he hesitated, then pressed on, Because I'd like to help if you'll let me. I'm not looking for charity, Mr. Blackwood. What about friendship? A small smile tugged at her lips. Friendship between a Wall Street banker and a homeless woman, that would be quite the stories, wouldn't it? Sometimes the best stories are the unexpected ones, Richard replied. Sarah shouldered her worn backpack, considering him. Tomorrow, then. Same time, same bench. Bring your thoughts on Sense and Sensibility. We'll see if you really know your Austen. As Richard watched her walk away, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a spark of genuine connection. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah was holding back something significant, some mystery that lay behind those guarded blue eyes. He had no way of knowing then how that chance encounter would change both their lives forever, or that Sarah carried a secret that would shake the very foundations of his carefully ordered world. Over the next few weeks, Richard found himself looking forward to his evening walks in Central Park with an anticipation that bordered on impatience. The crisp October days mellowed into November, and their literary discussions expanded to include everything from classic poetry to contemporary novels. Sarah's knowledge was impressive, though she remained carefully guarded about her past. One evening, Richard arrived at their usual bench to find Sarah already there, this time with a newspaper spread across her lap. The headline caught his eye. Hampton Family Scandal. Search for Missing Heiress Continues. She quickly folded it away when she saw him approaching. The news gets more depressing every day, she said lightly, but Richard noticed her hands trembling slightly as she tucked the paper into her bag. I brought you something, he said, deciding not to press the issue. From his briefcase, he pulled out a paper bag from Woolworths containing a warm wool sweater and a fresh copy of Wuthering Heights. Sarah's eyes widened, then narrowed. Richard, I told you. It's getting colder, he interrupted gently, and your copy was falling apart. Consider it a loan if you prefer. She touched the sweater's soft fabric, conflict evident on her face. So you're making this complicated. How so? Because kindness makes it harder to maintain proper distance, and distance is what I need right now. Richard sat beside her, leaving the usual careful space between them. Why? What are you running from, Sarah? She stiffened. What makes you think I'm running from anything? Because I've spent 20 years reading people across negotiating tables. You're too well educated, too refined to have always lived like this. Something happened. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching a group of children play with their new Cabbage Patch dolls near the fountain. Sometimes, she finally said, the safest place to hide is in plain sight, where nobody looks too closely at another homeless woman. Hide from what? She turned to face him fully then, her blue eyes intense. From people who would force me back into a life I can't live anymore. Please, Richard, don't ask me more than that. The raw pain in her voice made him want to reach for her hand, but he resisted. Instead, he changed the subject, telling her about his day at work, about the new McDonald's opening near his office, about anything to bring back her smile. It worked. Soon they were debating the merits of different Broadway shows, with Sarah displaying a surprisingly comprehensive knowledge of theatre. As they talked, Richard noticed how her whole face lit up when she laughed, how her hands moved expressively when she made a point she felt passionate about. You should see Cats while it's still running, she was saying, though I still prefer the more traditional. She trailed off, her face suddenly going pale. Richard followed her gaze to see a sleek black Mercedes crawling past the park entrance, its tinted windows concealing its occupants. I have to go, Sarah said abruptly, gathering her things. Now. Sarah, wait. Thank you for the sweater and the book, but I shouldn't come back here anymore. At least let me help you find a safer place to stay, Richard pleaded, concerned by her obvious fear. She shook her head. You've been kind, Richard. Kinder than I deserve, but getting involved with me would only bring trouble to your door. She hesitated, then added softly, some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Before he could respond, she hurried away, disappearing into the growing darkness. Richard stood watching long after she'd gone, the weight of her unspoken secrets hanging in the air between them. That night, lying in his luxurious penthouse apartment, Richard couldn't get Sarah out of his mind. The fear he'd seen in her eyes haunted him. He thought about her careful speech, her extensive knowledge of literature and theatre, the way she carried herself despite her circumstances. Making a decision, he reached for his phone and dialed a number he rarely used. "Frank, it's Richard Blackwood. I need you to look into something for me." Discreetly, he paused, choosing his words carefully. "I need information about any prominent women who've gone missing in the last year, particularly anyone connected to the Hampton family." As he hung up the phone, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something far more complicated than a simple story of a woman down on her luck. But the thought of never seeing Sarah again was somehow worse than any risk he might be taking. In the distance, a siren wailed through the Manhattan night, and Richard wondered if somewhere out there Sarah was still running from whatever, or whoever, had driven her to the streets. Frank's manila envelope arrived on Richard's desk early Monday morning. Inside, he found newspaper clippings and photographs that made his heart race. The most recent article featured a photograph of Sarah, though in it, she wore pearls and designer clothing, her hair elegantly styled. The caption read, "Sarah Hampton Pierce, missing telecommunications heiress." The story painted a disturbing picture. Sarah had vanished 3 months after her father's suspicious death, just before she was set to inherit control of Hampton Communications. Her husband, James Pierce, claimed she'd suffered a nervous breakdown and disappeared with a significant portion of the family's liquid assets. But something about James Pierce's smooth explanations set off warning bells in Richard's mind. The man's business dealings showed a pattern of aggressive takeovers and questionable practices. More tellingly, he'd quickly assumed control of Hampton Communications in Sarah's absence. Richard hadn't seen Sarah at their bench for over a week. As November's chill deepened, he worried about where she might be seeking shelter. He kept returning each evening, hoping to see her familiar figure. Finally, on a particularly cold night, she appeared. "I had you investigated," Richard said without preamble. Sarah's face went still. "Then you know why I can't stay. I know your husband is trying to steal your company. What I don't know is why you're hiding instead of fighting." "Because James tried to kill me, Richard." Her voice was barely a whisper. "The night before I disappeared, I found evidence that he'd poisoned my father. When I confronted him..." She pulled back her sleeve, revealing a faint scar. "Let's just say I was lucky to escape with my life. You have proof about your father. Hidden away. But James has too many people in his pocket. Police, private investigators, even some judges. Going public would be suicide." Richard leaned forward. "What if you had someone with resources on your side? Someone who could help you build a case safely?" "I can't ask that of you." "You're not asking, I'm offering." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Why? Why would you risk everything for someone you barely know?" Richard felt the truth of his next words even as he spoke them. "Because in these past weeks, I've come to care about you more than I've cared about anyone in years." A blush colored Sarah's cheeks, but before she could respond, the black Mercedes appeared again at the park's entrance. This time, it stopped. "Get up, walk naturally," Richard said quietly, offering his arm. "Say my car's just around the corner." Sarah hesitated only a moment before taking it. They strolled away from the bench, Richard's heart pounding as he heard car doors opening behind them. Just as they reached the corner, he heard footsteps approaching rapidly. "Mrs. Pierce," a man's voice called out. They broke into a run. Richard's Jaguar XJ6 sat idling where his driver always waited. They dove into the back seat. "Go," Richard commanded, and the car pulled away from the curb with a squeal of tires. In the rearview mirror, Richard saw 2 men in dark suits standing in the street, watching their departure. Sarah trembled beside him, her face pale. "They'll trace your car," she said. "Let them. My apartment has security, and I have lawyers. You're not alone anymore, Sarah." She turned to face him, moonlight from the window silvering her tears. "I lost everything when I ran. My home, my identity, my father's legacy." "No." Richard squeezed her hand. "You lost access to those things, but they're still yours, and I promise you, we're going to get them back." As the Jaguar wound through Manhattan's glittering streets, Sarah's hand remained in his, a silent acknowledgement of trust freely given. Richard knew that by helping her, he was making powerful enemies. But watching her profile in the passing lights, he realized some things were worth any risk. What he didn't know was that the most dangerous part of their journey was just beginning. Richard's Upper East Side penthouse felt like a fortress compared to the shelters Sarah had been calling home. Still, as she stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the twinkling cityscape below, she couldn't shake the feeling of exposure. The same lights that made Manhattan magical also made her feel vulnerable, like a specimen under glass. "The security team has been briefed," Richard said, returning from his home office. "No one gets up here without clearance." He handed her a mug of hot chocolate, made with real Ghirardelli chocolate, a luxury she hadn't tasted in months. "Your doorman probably thinks you've lost your mind," Sarah said, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Bringing a homeless woman up to your penthouse. Marcus is paid very well to think only about security, not social commentary." Richard settled into one of his leather armchairs, loosening his tie. "Now, tell me everything. Start with the evidence you have against James." Sarah took a deep breath. "It's in a safety deposit box at Manhattan Savings and Trust. Account records showing mysterious payments from Hampton Communications to offshore accounts. Letters between James and the doctor who treated my father, discussing dosages of something that was never part of his prescribed medications. And," she hesitated, "a recording. The night I confronted James, I was wearing my Sony Walkman. I'd modified it with a recording function, something I learned from my father. He always said in business, keep a record of everything. You recorded him confessing. Not directly, but his threats were explicit. Combined with the other evidence, it's damning. The problem is I can't access the safety deposit box. James has frozen all my accounts, reported my ID as stolen. I'm legally dead on paper." Richard leaned forward. "But you still have the key." Sarah reached under her shirt and pulled out a small key on a silver chain. "I never take it off, but it's useless without proper identification." "Not necessarily," Richard smiled. "Always, I happen to be on the board of Manhattan Savings and Trust." "Richard, no. If James finds out you're helping me, he already knows I'm involved. Those men tonight, they'll have reported back. We don't have the luxury of playing it safe anymore." Sarah set down her mug and began pacing. "You don't understand. James doesn't just make problems disappear. He destroys them completely. The private investigator who was helping me, they found him in the East River. The secretary who provided some of the documents, her car's brakes mysteriously failed on the Taconic Parkway. All the more reason not to face him alone." Richard stood and crossed to her, gently catching her arms to stop her pacing. "Sarah, look at me. I have resources, connections. I can help protect you." She looked up at him, close enough now to see the flecks of green in his hazel eyes. "I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me. Nothing will happen to either of us. Tomorrow morning we'll get that evidence. Then we'll take it to someone I trust at the FBI. James Pierce isn't the only one with connections." A knock at the door made them both jump. Richard's housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, entered with an armload of shopping bags. "The clothes you requested, Mr. Blackwood," she said, setting them down, "and some personal items for the lady." Sarah peered into the bags to find everything from designer jeans to silk blouses, all in her size. "Richard, this is too much. You need to look the part tomorrow," he said simply. "We're walking into that bank as if you belong there. No one questions confidence." After Mrs. Chen left, Sarah pulled out a classic Diane von Furstenberg wrap dress. "I used to have one just like this." "I know. I found photos from the Hampton Communications charity gala last year." He paused. "You belonged in that world, Sarah. We're going to get it back for you." She traced the dress's silk pattern with her finger. "That world isn't what you think. All the wealth, the glamour. It's a beautiful cage. Sometimes I think running away was the first real choice I ever made for myself." Richard watched her, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Is that why you're so reluctant to go back? Not just fear of James, but fear of losing your freedom? Is it terrible to admit that some part of me felt more alive sleeping on park benches and reading paperback novels than I ever did at charity galas." She gave a hollow laugh. "God, that sounds insane." "It sounds human." Richard's voice was soft. "But you don't have to choose between freedom and your birthright. Once James is out of the picture, you can run Hampton Communications your way." Sarah set the dress aside and hugged herself. "If we survive getting him out of the picture." "We will." Richard's phone rang, interrupting the moment. "Excuse me, I need to take this, it's Frank." Sarah watched him walk to his office, admiring despite herself how his tailored suit showed off his athletic build. She'd been fighting her growing attraction to him, telling herself it was just gratitude, or the natural response to finding kindness in a harsh world. But there was something more, something that made her heart race whenever he was near. She forced herself to look away. Tomorrow would be dangerous enough without complications of the heart. Richard returned, looking grave. "Frank's sources say James has called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow afternoon. He's going to try to push through a merger that would effectively dissolve Hampton Communications into one of his shell companies. If that happens..." "The evidence becomes irrelevant," Sarah finished. "The company assets will be so scattered through different corporations that proving fraud will be nearly impossible." "Then we move now." Richard checked his watch. "It's just past midnight. The bank opens at 9. That gives us 8 hours to plan every detail." He picked up the phone again. "I'm calling my driver, and Sarah..." She looked up to find his eyes intense with determination. "Pack that dress. Tomorrow. We remind the world who Sarah Hampton really is." Sarah felt a shiver that had nothing to do with fear. The way Richard looked at her, like she was someone worth fighting for, made her feel stronger than she had in months. As she gathered the clothes Mrs. Chen had brought, she heard him making calls, mobilizing the considerable resources at his disposal. Outside, the city that never sleeps sparkled with possibility. Come morning, they would walk into Manhattan, savings and trust, and set in motion events that would either restore everything she'd lost or cost them everything they had, including, possibly, their lives. But for now, in the warm safety of Richard's penthouse, Sarah allowed herself to feel something she hadn't dared experience since the night she fled her old life. Hope. Dawn broke over Manhattan with steely determination. Sarah stood before the mirror in Richard's guest bathroom, hardly recognizing herself. The Diane von Furstenberg dress fit perfectly, her honey-blonde hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and the subtle makeup Mrs. Chen had helped her apply transformed her from a woman who'd been living on the streets into the heiress she'd once been. Only her eyes betrayed her nervousness. "Ready?" Richard appeared in the doorway, impeccable in a charcoal Armani suit. He held out a small velvet box. "What's this?" "Your signature pearls, the ones in every society photo of you." He opened the box to reveal a string of perfectly matched South Sea pearls. "I had them delivered this morning." Sarah's hand trembled as she touched them. "They look exactly like... They are yours, the originals. I tracked them to a pawn shop in Queens." He lifted them from the box. "May I?" She turned, letting him fasten them around her neck. His fingers brushed her skin, sending an electric current down her spine. In the mirror, their eyes met. "Perfect," he said softly, and Sarah wasn't sure if he meant the pearls or something else entirely. The drive to Manhattan Savings and Trust was tense with anticipation. Richard's security team had swept the route and reported no signs of James's men, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. "Remember," Richard said as they pulled up to the bank's imposing facade, "you're Sarah Hampton Pierce, here to access your safety deposit box. You belong here. Anyone who questions that will have to deal with me." The bank's marble lobby echoed with their footsteps as they approached the main desk. Sarah kept her chin high, channeling years of social training. The clerk looked up, eyes widening slightly in recognition. "Mrs. Pierce, we were informed you were temporarily indisposed." Sarah's voice was pure old money confidence. "I'm quite recovered, thank you. I'd like to access my safety deposit box." "Of course, but I'll need to verify your identification. Mrs. Pierce is here with me." Richard stepped forward, his presence commanding. "Richard Blackwood, board member. I can personally verify her identity." The clerk hesitated, fingers hovering over the computer keyboard. "I'll need to check with—" "Is there a problem?" A new voice interrupted. Sarah turned to see Thomas Wellington, the bank president, approaching with a concerned expression. "Tom," Richard greeted him warmly. "Thank you for coming down. As I mentioned on the phone, Mrs. Pierce needs access to her box immediately." Wellington studied Sarah carefully. "Yes, of course, though I must say your husband was quite insistent that all your accounts be frozen due to your condition." "My husband," Sarah said clearly, "does not speak for me. Not anymore." Wellington glanced between them, then nodded slowly. "Follow me, please." They were led to the vault area, where Wellington personally retrieved Sarah's safety deposit box. But just as they were about to enter a private viewing room, a commotion erupted in the lobby. "Sarah!" James Pierce's voice boomed across the marble expanse. "Step away from that box." Sarah's heart thundered as her husband strode toward them, flanked by two men she recognized as his private security. He looked exactly as she remembered, handsome in an artificial way, like a mannequin carved from expensive soap. "Mr. Pierce," Wellington began, "this is highly irregular." "My wife is mentally unstable," James announced loudly. "She's been missing for months, living God knows where, clearly not in her right mind. I have papers from her doctors." "I'm not sick, James," Sarah's voice cut through his performance. "I'm finally seeing clearly, clearly enough to know what you did to my father." James's face hardened. "Sarah, darling, you're confused. Remember what the doctors said about your paranoid delusions." "The only delusion was believing I could trust you." Sarah clutched the safety deposit box closer. "It's over, James. I have proof." "Proof?" He laughed. But Sarah saw the flash of fear in his eyes. "Of what? That you're unwell? That you've been living like a vagrant, consorting with—" His eyes flicked dismissively to Richard. "Questionable companions." Richard stepped forward, his voice quiet but carrying an edge of steel. "I suggest you leave, Mr. Pierce, before your attempts to gaslight your wife are witnessed by even more people. This doesn't concern you, Blackwood. Actually, it does. You see, I've spent the past month documenting every threat, every attempt at intimidation. The FBI is very interested in your pattern of silencing people who get too close to the truth." James's polished facade cracked slightly. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Richard held up his phone. "Should we call Special Agent Morrison right now? I'm sure he'd love to hear your explanation for the offshore accounts, the mysterious deaths, the evidence of corporate fraud." "You have no proof of anything," James snarled, but sweat had begun to bead on his forehead. "No." Sarah set the safety deposit box on a nearby counter and opened it with steady hands. "Everything's here, James. The bank transfers, the letters from Dr. Reynolds about the special medications, and of course," she withdrew a small tape, "our last conversation, where you admitted killing my father when he threatened to cut you out of the company." The color drained from James's face. His security men shifted uncomfortably, clearly not having signed up for a murder conspiracy. "It's over," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. "So you can leave now, dignity somewhat intact, or you can wait for the FBI to arrest you in front of all these witnesses. Your choice." For a moment, Sarah thought James might actually lunge for the box, but years of carefully maintaining his sophisticated image won out. He straightened his tie, tried to summon his usual smirk. "You've made a serious mistake," he said softly. "Both of you." He turned on his heel and strode out, his security men following like well-trained dogs. As soon as he was gone, Sarah's knees buckled. Richard caught her elbow, steadying her. "It's not over," she whispered. "He'll try something else, something worse." "Let him try." Richard's voice was grim with determination. "I've already arranged for security at my apartment, and the evidence is being copied and distributed to multiple secure locations. If anything happens to either of us, it all goes public immediately." Wellington cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere more private. My office is at your disposal." The next few hours were a blur of phone calls and document signing. Richard's lawyers arrived, then FBI agents. Sarah told her story again and again, each telling draining more of her energy until she felt hollow. Finally, As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the bank's marble floors, Richard touched her arm gently. "Let's go home. You need rest." Home. The word caught in Sarah's throat. She no longer knew where that was. As if reading her thoughts, Richard added softly, "My home is your sanctuary for as long as you need it. No pressure, no expectations, just safety." Sarah looked up at him. This man who'd risked everything to help her without asking anything in return. In his eyes, she saw something that made her heart skip. Not pity, not mere attraction, but understanding. He knew what it was to wear masks, to play roles, to long for something real in a world of elegant facades. Together they walked out of the bank into the crisp November air. Sarah felt lighter, as if she'd set down a heavy burden she'd carried for months, but she also felt the weight of James's threat. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As they climbed into Richard's waiting car, Sarah caught his hand. "Thank you. Not just for today, but for seeing me. The real me, even when I was trying so hard to stay invisible." Richard's fingers tightened around hers. "You could never be invisible, Sarah. You shine too brightly for that." The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the flow of traffic. In the back seat, their hands remained linked, a quiet acknowledgement of the connection growing between them. Sarah knew there would be more battles ahead, more dangers to face. But for the first time since she'd fled her old life, she didn't feel alone. What she didn't know was that the most dangerous and most wonderful part of her journey was still to come. The respite they'd found at Richard's penthouse was shattered at precisely 3:47 a.m. by the shrill ring of his private line. Sarah, who'd been fitfully dozing in the guest room, heard his muffled voice followed by rapid footsteps. "Sarah!" Richard burst into the room without knocking. "We need to leave. Now." "What's happened?" James's men breached the lower floor security. "They're in the building." Sarah threw on clothes with practiced speed, muscle memory from months of needing to move quickly. As she grabbed her few possessions, she heard the distant ding of the elevator. "Fire escape," Richard said, already moving. "My driver's waiting in the alley." They slipped out onto the metal platform just as they heard the sound of splintering wood, someone breaking down the penthouse door. The November wind whipped Sarah's nightgown around her legs as they descended, the iron stairs clanging beneath their feet. Halfway down, a window above them shattered. Something metallic clattered on the grating near Sarah's feet. Her eyes widened in recognition. "Gas!" she shouted, pulling Richard down the stairs faster. Tear gas began billowing from the canister, burning their eyes and throats. They stumbled the last few flights, practically falling into the alley where Richard's faithful driver waited with the engine running. As they peeled away from the curb, Sarah saw dark figures emerging from the service entrance. "They were ready for us," Richard said grimly, wiping streaming eyes. "Someone inside my building tipped them off." "Where are we going?" "Somewhere they won't think to look." He gave an address to the driver, then turned to Sarah. "So how do you trust me?" She met his reddened eyes. "One with my life." The car wound through Manhattan's empty streets, eventually pulling up to a rundown apartment building in the Lower East Side. Richard led her to a third-floor walk-up that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1960s. "My first apartment in New York," and he explained, unlocking the door. "I kept it as a reminder of where I started. No one knows about it except Frank." Inside was sparse but clean, a studio with basic furniture and a kitchenette. Sarah sank onto the worn couch, exhaustion finally catching up with her. "James won't stop," she said quietly. "Not until he destroys everything and everyone standing in his way." Richard sat beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Then we destroy him first. The FBI has the evidence. They're building their case." "Cases take time. James will move faster." Sarah stood and began pacing. "The board meeting is in 10 hours. Once that merger goes through, it won't." Richard caught her hand as she passed, pulling her to a stop. "Because you're going to walk into that meeting and take back your company." Sarah stared at him. "That's suicide." "It's brilliant. It's the last thing James would expect. He thinks you're running scared. Instead, you'll walk in there looking exactly like the Sarah Hampton they remember, with me and a team of lawyers backing you up." The board members, many of them were my father's friends before James turned them against me. Exactly. Deep down, they know something's wrong. They've just been too afraid to act. Give them a reason to remember whose daughter you are. Sarah sank back onto the couch, mind racing. We'd need documents proving my identity, proof of James's fraud, statements from the FBI. Already being prepared. Frank's been working on this contingency plan for days. She turned to face him fully. Why are you doing all this? Really? You're risking everything, your reputation, your safety, maybe your life. Why? Richard was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft but intense. Because from the moment I saw you on that park bench, something in me recognized something in you. Not just your beauty or your intelligence, but your spirit, the way you held onto your dignity, your sense of self, even when you had nothing else. You reminded me that there are things worth fighting for beyond money and power. Sarah's breath caught as he reached up to brush a tear from her cheek. Richard, let me finish. These past weeks, watching you fight back against impossible odds, seeing your courage and determination, I've fallen in love with you, Sarah. Not the society heiress you used to be. Not the woman you're pretending to be, but you, the real you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth and possibility. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. She knew she should pull away, maintain distance until this crisis was over. Instead, she found herself leaning closer, drawn by the magnetic pull between them. Their faces were inches apart when a knock at the door made them both jump. Mr. Blackwood, Frank's voice called softly. I have the documents you requested. Reality crashed back in. They had work to do, battles to fight, a company to save. Whatever was growing between them would have to wait. But as they spent the pre-dawn hours planning their assault on the board meeting, Sarah felt the warm weight of Richard's confession in her heart. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt truly unafraid. She just prayed they'd both live long enough to explore what might have happened if Frank hadn't knocked. The Hampton Communications boardroom buzzed with tension on that crisp November morning. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, watching James Pierce pace at the head of the massive mahogany table. He'd spent the last 10 minutes outlining the merger proposal, his confidence growing with each slide of his presentation. And so, gentlemen, by merging with Pierce Global Ventures, we ensure Hampton Communications' future in an increasingly competitive market. I'll need your votes now, before... The double doors swung open. Sarah stood in the doorway, elegant in a navy Chanel suit, her grandmother's pearls gleaming at her throat. Richard stood beside her, along with a team of lawyers and 2 FBI agents. I believe, Sarah said clearly, that my father's company deserves more discussion before any votes are cast. The room erupted in murmurs. James's face contorted briefly before smoothing into a practiced smile. Sarah, darling, this is hardly the place for your episodes. Actually, Richard stepped forward, distributing folders to each board member. This is exactly the place. Inside those folders, you'll find proof of extensive financial fraud, including documentation of how James Pierce systematically drained company assets into offshore accounts. These are baseless accusations, James snarled, but Sarah could see the fear in his eyes. Are they? Sarah moved to stand at her father's old place at the head of the table. George, she addressed one of the oldest board members, her father's friend of 30 years. Remember when Dad said he was investigating irregularities in the Asian division before his heart attack? George nodded slowly, realization dawning in his eyes. You'll find toxicology reports in those folders, Sarah continued. Along with correspondence between James and the doctor, who falsified my father's death certificate, and a recording of James admitting to everything. This is ridiculous. James moved toward the door, but the FBI agent stepped into his path. Mr. Pierce, one said quietly, we have some questions about several suspicious deaths connected to Hampton Communications and the attempted murder of your wife. The next hour was chaos. James was led away in handcuffs, screaming threats and accusations. Board members huddled with lawyers, reviewing documents with shocked expressions. Through it all, Sarah stood tall, answering questions with quiet authority, every inch her father's daughter. Finally, the room cleared except for Sarah and Richard. She sank into her father's chair, running her fingers over the smooth wood of his desk. "He would be so proud of you," Richard said softly. "See, I couldn't have done it without you." Sarah looked up at him, her heart full of emotions she could no longer contain. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said last night." Richard stilled. "Have you?" "Yes, about recognizing something in me that first day in the park." She stood, moving closer to him. "I felt it too, even when I was trying so hard not to feel anything, to stay invisible. You saw me, the real me." "Sarah." His voice was rough with emotion. "I fell in love with you too," she whispered. "Your kindness, your strength, the way you fought for me without trying to control me. You gave me back my power, my voice, my life. But more than that, you gave me something I've never had before." "What's that?" "The freedom to be myself, to be loved for who I am, not what I represent." Richard's hand came up to cup her cheek. "Tell you are the most remarkable woman I've ever known." Finally, after weeks of growing tension, months of fear and longing, their lips met in a kiss that felt like coming home. It was gentle at first, then deepening with all the emotion they'd held back for so long. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Sarah smiled. "So what happens now?" "Now," Richard said, "you rebuild your father's company your way. Make it a force for good in the world. And us? Us?" He kissed her again, softly. "We take it one day at a time. No pressure, no expectations, just two people who found love in the most unexpected place." Sarah looked around the boardroom, remembering all the times she'd watched her father work here, dreaming of the day she'd carry on his legacy. But now she had something even better, a chance to honor his memory while creating her own path, with a man who loved her for exactly who she was. "One day at a time sounds perfect," she said, and kissed him again. Epilogue. 1 year later. The bench where they first met still stood in Central Park, though now it bore a small bronze plaque, "Where two hearts found home." Sarah often stopped there on her walks between Hampton Communications, headquarters, and Richard's penthouse, now their shared home. The company was thriving under her leadership, focusing on ethical business practices and technological innovation. James was serving a lengthy prison sentence, his empire of corruption dismantled, but more importantly, Sarah had found something she never knew she needed: a love built on trust, respect, and the freedom to be herself. She and Richard had married in a small ceremony 6 months after the boardroom confrontation, exchanging vows in the park where their story began. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, they still sat on that bench together, reading Jane Austen and talking about everything and nothing. And Sarah would think about how sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about dramatic rescues or grand gestures, but about two people who see each other clearly and choose each other freely, day after day after day. Their story wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs, and that made it better than any fairy tale. Thank you for watching today's story. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a big thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel to relive the magic of the 80s every day with our heartfelt stories. May God bless you and your family, and don't forget to click on the video popping up on the screen right now. It's another totally rad story you won't want to miss. See you in the next video, and stay awesome.